My security alert went off at 2:53 a.m. I checked the camera. It was my own son-in-law in my home office, a small silver flashlight tucked in his hand, calmly rummaging through my desk. No mask, no gloves. I didn't call the police. Instead, I sat still in the dark and watched him for 14 minutes. When he hid the documents inside his jacket and left, I finally picked up the phone to make a call that would destroy the entire takeover plan he had painstakingly prepared. Before we begin, I'm genuinely grateful you're here. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I read every single one. A small note, this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but everything it's trying to teach you is worth keeping. It was November 2023, and I hadn't slept in 3 nights. Not because I couldn't. I want to make that clear. A man who has driven freight through ice storms on I-70 at 2 in the morning learns to sleep anywhere cab of a truck folding chair in a dispatch yard. Once on a concrete floor in a loading dock in Dayton because the motel was full and the delivery couldn't wait. Sleep was never my problem. This was a choice. I had turned off every light in the house by 9 o'clock. Not the way you turn off lights when you're heading to bed, methodical room by room. The way you'd close up a warehouse at the end of a shift. Kitchen first, then the hallway. The dining room June had repainted twice because she could never decide between warm ivory and antique linen. The study, the upstairs landing, every switch, every lamp, every nightlight we'd put in the bathroom years ago when the grandkids started visiting more often. One by one until the house was the kind of dark that has weight to it. From the street, 14 Pinecrest Ridge looked empty. That was the point. My company truck, a black F250, the one with the Gaines freight decal on the driver's side door, had been sitting in the lot at the warehouse since 4 in the afternoon. I'd asked Ted, my floor manager, to drive me home in his personal vehicle and not to mention it to anyone. Ted has worked for me for 31 years. He didn't ask why. Men who've been in the freight business long enough learn that sometimes the fewer questions you ask, the better the load moves. The 1978 Chevy sat in the garage where it always sat, dark green chrome bumper, the engine rebuilt twice but the body all original. I'd bought it in 1979 after 7 years of driving other men's trucks, and in 44 years, I had never once used it as a daily driver. It was mine the way certain things become yours, not because you used them, but because you earned them. Anyone who knew me knew that truck didn't move unless something significant was happening. But significant, I had decided, could mean more than one thing. On the sofa in the living room, I sat with my hands flat on my knees. Under the throw pillow to my left, face down, was a tablet. The screen was dark. The camera app was running. I had tested it 3 times that afternoon. It was connected to a motion sensor I'd had a security technician install 6 weeks earlier along the south-facing garage window, the one with the old latch that was harder to see from the driveway. The sensor communicated with the tablet through a wireless signal. No sound, just a single vibration when triggered. One pulse like a heartbeat. I had thought of everything I could think of. That was all a man my age could do. 71 years old, 48 years of running freight across 5 states. I had built Gaines Freight from a single dispatch yard outside Ironwood City into an operation with 340 trucks and contracts in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, and West Virginia. I had survived recessions, fuel crises, 2 floods that took out a depot apiece, and 1 very bad winter in 2009 that nearly broke us. I was not a man who panicked easily, but 3 months ago something had started to feel wrong. Not loud wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up as a number that's slightly off in a quarterly report. A 2-week delay in paperwork that should have taken 3 days. A question answered just a half second too smoothly. In this business, I had learned one thing above everything else: when a number doesn't add up, you don't ignore it and hope the math fixes itself. You pull the load. You check the weight. You find out what's really in the trailer. I hadn't told anyone what I suspected. Not yet. Only Roy, my younger brother, 74 years old, retired after 30 years behind the wheel, knew that something was happening. I had told him just enough to keep him close without putting him in the middle of something he didn't need to be in the middle of. Roy was the only person in my life I trusted completely and unconditionally, the way you trust the one road you've driven so many times you could navigate it in a blackout. I sat in the dark and let the house settle around me. June's scarf was still on the arm of the chair across from me, pale blue, the color she always wore in November because she said it matched the sky before snow. I hadn't moved it since the spring of 2021. Some people would say that's not healthy. Those people never lost June Gaines. The wall clock in the hallway read 10:47 when I closed my eyes. Not to sleep, just to listen. Wind against the east side of the house, the November kind, the kind with teeth. The low hum of the heating unit cycling on in the basement. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the road and was gone, then silence. The specific silence of a house that has been lived in for decades, that knows the sound of itself so well that anything unfamiliar registers like a splinter. I had been in this business long enough to know that trouble rarely comes from the direction you're watching. You spend your whole life checking the front door, and it's the loading dock on the south side that gives way. I didn't know exactly what was coming. I didn't know when. What I knew was this: I had set the stage. I had removed every reason for anyone watching from the outside to believe this house was anything but vacant. No lights, no car, no movement. A dark house on a cold November night, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened. I had made myself invisible inside my own home. And I was going to sit in that dark, in that silence. In that chair June used to read in every Sunday morning with her coffee and her library book. I was going to sit there for as long as it took. The clock moved. 10:47 became 11. 11 became midnight. Midnight became 1. I didn't shift in my seat. I had learned patience the hard way, on long hauls where you couldn't stop and couldn't speed up, and all you could do was stay the course and trust that the road would eventually deliver you somewhere. My left hand rested on the throw pillow. Beneath it, the tablet waited. At exactly 2:53 in the morning, it vibrated once. I opened my eyes. I did not move anything else, not my shoulders, not my feet, not my head. Just my eyes opening in the dark, already adjusted, already ready. With the slowness of a man who has spent 3 nights rehearsing exactly this moment, I lifted the edge of the pillow and tilted the tablet toward me just enough to see the screen without letting the glow reach the windows. The motion sensor on the south-facing garage window had triggered. Someone was at the side of my house, and whoever it was, they were moving like they knew exactly where they were going. I did not move. I did not breathe any louder than I had to. I just watched. The camera feed was grainy, the way night vision always is, that greenish-gray wash that flattens everything into shadow and outline. But it was clear enough for what I needed. A figure came through the south garage window, slowly, deliberately, with the kind of patience that told me this wasn't improvised. No crash, no alarm, just the soft resistance of a latch being worked open by someone who had thought this through long before tonight. The motion sensor caught the vibration the moment the latch gave way. One pulse against my palm. He was inside in under 40 seconds. Dark jacket, knit cap pulled low. No gloves. No mask. He swept a small silver flashlight once around the garage, a quick, practiced sweep, the kind a man makes. Not because he's lost, but because he wants confirmation that what he expects is actually there. His beam crossed the workbench, the shelving unit, and then the Chevy in the corner. He looked at that truck for exactly 1 second, then moved on. He knew a cold Chevy sitting in a garage didn't mean Walter Gaines was home. He knew my habits better than I had realized. He found the interior hallway door without hesitating. Straight line, no pause. He turned the knob with his left hand and slipped through like he'd walked the route in his mind, enough times that his feet already knew the way. He went directly to my home office and pulled the door almost shut behind him. Then he started on the desk. Top drawer first, quick, barely a minute. Middle drawer longer. He pulled folders out, set them on the desk surface, paged through them, with his flashlight tucked between 2 fingers, so his hands stayed free. He photographed certain pages with his phone. He worked the way a man works, when he's rehearsed the steps. No wasted motion, no hesitation. That might mean doubt. Whatever he was looking for, he had a clear picture of it. Bottom drawer, then back to the middle for something he'd passed over the first time. 14 minutes. I counted every one. I want to be honest about why I sat there and let those 14 minutes pass. Because some people would ask, why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you flip the lights on? Here is why. A police call that night would have produced a trespassing charge, at best a misdemeanor, a court date, and a story that ended before it truly started. I would have caught one man in one room. But what I suspected was not one man in one room. It was a structure, financial, legal, deliberate, built over months. You don't dismantle a structure by pulling one brick. You find the foundation first. In the freight business, we don't brake hard when a load shifts. We assess the weight, adjust the line, and finish the drive. 48 years had taught me that much. At the 11-minute mark, he stood up straight to check his phone. The flashlight shifted, and for just a moment, the beam caught the left side of his face. I saw the wedding ring first. Gold band, slightly wider than standard. I had watched my daughter slide it onto that finger 9 years ago in a church 2 miles from this house. On an October Saturday, while June pressed a handkerchief to the corner of her eye, and I stood in the front pew working hard not to lose my composure. Then the jaw, the tilt of his chin when he was processing something a few degrees left, like he was listening to the words rather than reading them. 9 years of that gesture across my kitchen table, at Thanksgiving, at Sunday dinners, at the visits that grew more frequent after June passed. Conrad Hale, my son-in-law, the estate attorney. He folded the documents, tucked them inside his jacket, and retraced his steps without hurrying. Hallway, garage, window, gone. I sat in the dark for 2 more hours. Not because I couldn't move, because I needed the stillness. There's a kind of thinking that only happens when there's nothing left to do but let the shape of a thing settle. I let it settle. Around 4:30, an evening from 9 years ago came back without invitation. The first time Conrad came to dinner, June had made pot roast her standard welcome. He'd eaten 2 plates, complimented her twice. After they left, June stood at the sink and said quietly, without turning around, "He seems careful, Walter." I had taken it as a compliment, standing at the edge of the living room as morning gray began showing through the curtains. I looked at the Chevy in the garage. Bought it in 1979, age 26, 7 years into building something from nothing. I had left Driftwood Hollow at 19 with $600 and the kind of stubbornness that either gets a man somewhere or gets him killed. The Chevy was the first thing I'd ever owned outright. The first proof the stubbornness was working. I was not going to let what came after disappear in 14 minutes. Careful. June had used exactly the right word. She always did. At 5 in the morning, I picked up the burner phone from my jacket pocket, a prepaid flip phone bought 3 weeks earlier at a gas station on Route 9. One number saved. I had been waiting for the moment when I had enough to justify making the call. That moment had arrived. I made coffee at 5 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table where June and I used to argue about the heating bill. She wanted 68 degrees. I kept it at 64 because I had grown up in a house where you wore 2 sweaters indoors and were grateful for them. We never resolved it. After she was gone, I turned the thermostat up to 68 and left it there. Some arguments end not because someone wins, but because one of you runs out of time to keep having them. The kitchen was the one room I still kept a light on at night. A small lamp near the coffee maker, nothing dramatic. The rest of the house I moved through carefully in the dark, the way you navigate a room where the furniture has shifted and you haven't learned the new layout yet. But the kitchen always felt like itself. Same yellow walls June chose in 1987. Same round table with the nick in the corner, where Diane dropped a ceramic bowl the summer she was 12. I had never fixed that nick. Some things you leave because fixing them would mean admitting they happened. I drank my coffee black, and I did not rush. 48 years in freight had taught me that the worst decisions come from men who move before they've finished thinking. You react to a bad road report without pulling over first, without checking the map, and you end up on an alternate route that turns out to be worse than the one you left. Different and better are not the same thing. So I sat. I let the gray November light come slowly through the window while Ironwood City slept, and I thought. I thought about Driftwood Hollow first. I always do when something large is pressing down on me. My father worked the coal seam at Harlan County for 32 years. He had one saying he repeated until it became the air inside our house. Said, "A man who owns nothing answers to everyone." He said it without bitterness, just as fact, the way you state a distance or the temperature outside. But I heard the instruction underneath it every single time. I left in the spring of 1972. 19 years old, $600 a duffel bag that held everything I owned without straining. I did not look back. Not because I didn't love the place I did, in the way you love something that shaped you without asking permission, but because looking back felt like the first step toward going back, and going back was not part of the plan. 7 years I drove freight for other companies. Learned every interstate between Kentucky and the Ohio River. Learned how dispatchers think, what makes a driver worth calling again, and what gets you quietly taken off the schedule. Slept in my cab more nights than in a bed. Saved everything that wasn't spoken for by food or fuel. In the fall of 1979, I put a down payment on a small dispatch yard on the west side of Ironwood City. 2 acres, a cinder block office, 3 trucks that needed more work than I had originally budgeted for. I named it Gaines Freight. Because the name was honest, it told you exactly what it was and who was responsible for it. No flourishes. 48 years later, 340 trucks carried that name across 5 states. You build something 1 truck at a time, 1 contract at a time, 1 hard winter at a time, until the thing you've built is larger than any version of yourself could have imagined at the start. Then there was Diane. She was born on a Tuesday. I was running a delivery through Cincinnati and had to pull over at a rest stop outside Hamilton when the hospital called. Sat in the cab for 20 minutes before I could drive again. Not because something was wrong, but because everything was right. And sometimes that is the harder thing to take in. 3 years ago, I called her into my office and told her she was becoming CEO of Gaines Freight. She looked at me for a long moment before she said anything like she was checking whether I truly meant it. I meant every word. Not because she was firstborn, because she had something June had something rarer than competence and harder to teach. June used to say it plainly. Any man can read a balance sheet. It takes a different kind of eye to read a room. The weight behind a handshake. The hesitation inside a voice that sounds confident. Diane had that eye. She had inherited it from her mother, the way some children inherit a laugh. The day Conrad shook my hand at the signing, he smiled the way a man smiles when he has arrived somewhere he intended to be all along. And there was something else in his expression, a quality I noticed, and then deliberately set aside. Not pride in his wife, not warmth. Something that moved more like calculation, like the look I had seen across negotiating tables my whole career. A man already 3 steps ahead of the conversation he was pretending to be present in. I had told myself it was just the nature of lawyers to think that way. I stood up, walked to the sink, and poured what was left of my coffee down the drain. I had spent 48 years building something that mattered. I was not going to spend one more morning pretending I hadn't seen what I saw last night. I picked up the burner phone. Roy answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting too. Roy's kitchen hadn't changed in 30 years. Same cracked linoleum floor the color of old mustard. Same coffee maker on the counter that sounded like a small engine turning over when it brewed. The coffee itself was the kind that freight drivers used to joke, could strip the finish off a hood dark and serious, no apology for what it was. I had driven the Chevy there in the dark, headlights off until I turned onto the county road. Not because I expected anyone to be watching at 5:30 in the morning on a residential street in November, but 3 months of quiet suspicion had rewired something in me. Every unnecessary light felt like an unnecessary word, and I had learned a long time ago that unnecessary words were how men gave themselves away. Roy was already at the table when I came through the side door. He had poured 2 cups before I arrived. He didn't ask why I was driving the Chevy instead of the company truck. He didn't ask why I had called at 5 in the morning and said only, "Roy's house, 7:30," and hung up. He just sat there with his hands around his mug and waited. That was Roy. 74 years old, retired after 30 years behind the wheel, more miles logged than most men see on an odometer in 2 lifetimes. He had driven tankers, flatbeds, refrigerated units through weather that would make a younger man pull over and pray. He was the kind of man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was be present and quiet and ready. He had learned that lesson the same place I had on long hauls alone, in the dark, where there was nobody to talk to, and the road didn't care about your feelings either way. I sat down across from him, pulled the tablet out of my jacket, and set it on the table between us without a word. "Watch this," I said. "All of it." I pressed play and set the tablet so Roy could see the screen. 14 minutes. I watched Roy instead of the video. I had already seen it twice by that point, and I needed to see it through someone else's eyes. He didn't react much. That was also Roy. His face stayed level, the way it does when he's processing something and doesn't want the processing to show. He picked up his coffee once midway through, then set it back down without drinking. When the video ended, he looked up. "How long have you known?" he said. "Known for certain since 2:53 this morning." I turned the tablet face down on the table. Suspected about 3 months. I walked him through it. August, I had requested a detailed statement from the legal reserve account, the one I had signed broad authority over 2 years earlier, to cover what Conrad described as ongoing legal consulting fees for a Wyoming expansion project. Standard practice, I had told myself at the time. A lawyer managing legal expenses. Nothing unusual. Conrad had taken 2 weeks to produce the statement. 2 weeks for paperwork that should have taken 3 days. He had given me explanations, a filing backlog, a junior associate out sick, a document request from a state regulatory office that had to take priority. Every excuse was plausible on its own. Together, they had a texture I recognized from 48 years of watching people explain things they didn't want explained. In the freight business, when a driver gives you 3 reasons for being late, the real reason is usually none of them. I had not confronted Conrad then. Instead, I had started watching. Quietly. The way you watch a gauge that's reading slightly off, not sounding the alarm, yet just keeping your eye on it, noting the pattern. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Roy asked. "Because I needed a blind spot," I said. "Conrad knows my office. He knows my house. He's been inside both enough times to know what's normal there and what isn't. But he doesn't know your kitchen table, Roy. He's never had a reason to think about it." Roy considered that. Nodded once slowly, the way he nods when something makes sense he wishes didn't. 3 weeks ago, I had hired a woman named Vivien to look at the finances. She came with a background that suited the situation: 12 years as a revenue agent with the IRS before she left to work independently. The last 8 of those years spent building cases around what she called structured misdirection money, moved in ways designed to look routine until you mapped the full picture. She was 52, thorough and not easily impressed by explanations. Roy had put me in contact with her through a case she had worked with a freight broker. He knew a situation I hadn't asked for details about, and Roy hadn't offered them. All contact with Vivien had gone through the burner phone. No emails, no calls from my regular line, no meetings at any address connected to me or to Gaines Freight. She had been working quietly for 3 weeks. "And," Roy said, "she's still working, but she sent a message yesterday. 2 words." Roy waited. "Found it." He set his mug down on the table with a sound that was quieter than it should have been given what those 2 words meant. "Does Diane know any of this?" he asked. The question sat in the kitchen for a moment. I looked at my coffee. Thought about Diane, the way she had looked at the signing ceremony when Conrad shook my hand, how proud she had seemed, how certain. "I don't know," I said. "And I need to find out." Roy stood up and refilled both our cups without asking whether I wanted more. "So what's the play, Walter?" I set the burner phone on the table between us. "We wait for Vivien's full report. Then we move." Roy nodded. He didn't ask how bad it was. Roy had been driving freight long enough to understand that you don't ask about the severity of a storm once you're already in it. You check your mirrors. You keep both hands on the wheel, and you trust that the road ahead is shorter than the road behind. I came home from Roy's and went straight upstairs, not to sleep, but to sit in the room where June used to keep her things. I do this when the weight of something gets to a certain point. I don't have a name for it that doesn't sound like something I'd be embarrassed to say out loud. It isn't superstition. It isn't grief. Exactly not anymore. Not after 2.5 years. It is something quieter than that. When you have lived alongside a person for 41 years, you absorb the way they think. You learn the questions they would ask, and the silences they would hold, and the moments when they would simply look at you until you figured it out yourself. June is gone, but the shape of how she thought is still in me somewhere. Coming to this room is how I find it. The door opened the way it always does, a slight resistance at the bottom where the carpet bunches, then it gives. I had never fixed that either. Inside the room was exactly as she left it in the spring of 2021. The dried flowers on the vanity dahlias. I think, though, I had never been good with names for flowers. Her book on the nightstand, face down, open to whatever page she had been reading. The last evening she felt well enough to read. A pair of soft-soled slippers near the door, toes pointing outward, the way feet naturally fall when you slip them off after a long day. I had not asked anyone to move these things. I had not moved them myself. People who did not know me well sometimes mentioned it carefully, the way people mention things they think you might not have considered. I had always considered it. I had simply decided differently. A man who spent 48 years tracking inventory down to the last item on a manifest was not going to misplace the contents of his wife's room by accident. Everything there was where it was, because I had chosen to leave it that way. And that choice was mine to make. I sat on the edge of the bed, not lying down, just sitting, the way you sit when you need to think, and lying down would feel like giving something up. June and Diane had a relationship I was never fully inside of. That's the nature of certain things between mothers and daughters. They exist in a register that husbands and fathers can observe, but not entirely enter. What I knew was this: June had loved Diane with the specific intensity of a woman who recognized herself in her child and was simultaneously proud of that and worried by it. She loves too much and checks too little. June had told me once, years before Conrad was part of any conversation. We had been talking about Diane's first serious relationship in college, a young man who turned out to be exactly as unreliable as June had suspected from the first dinner. I had defended Diane, then said that trusting people wasn't a flaw, that it was who she was, that the world needed people who led with their heart before their suspicion. June had looked at me with the particular patience she reserved for moments when she thought I was being sentimental at the expense of being honest. "That's not a flaw," I had said. She hadn't argued. She had simply moved on to something else, which was June's way of saying she disagreed, but had decided not to spend the energy proving it. I pulled open the small drawer in the nightstand on her side of the bed. The photograph was where it always was: Diane and Conrad's wedding 9 years ago. A 4x6 print, slightly bent at one corner from years of being in a drawer. In the photograph, Diane was laughing at something just outside the frame. Conrad had his hand at the small of her back and was looking at the camera. And June was smiling. Not a polite smile, not the careful expression of a woman performing happiness for a photograph. A real one, the kind that reached all the way up. June was not an easy woman to fool. I had watched her read people across 30 years of company dinners and neighborhood gatherings and family events where strangers became regular fixtures, and regular fixtures occasionally showed their true dimensions. She had a radar that I had come to trust more than my own, because it operated on information I couldn't always name or verify: something in the posture, the timing of a laugh, the way a person's eyes moved when they talked about themselves. She was rarely wrong, so if she had smiled at Conrad like that, genuinely, fully, without reservation, then one of two things was true. Either Conrad had been a different man 9 years ago and had become something else since, or June had wanted so badly for Diane to have this that she had let herself be persuaded by the wanting. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I put it back. What I was carrying that afternoon was not anger. Anger would have been easier. Anger has a direction, a heat, a momentum you can use. What I was carrying was something slower. The specific weight of a man who understands finally that he missed something he should have seen. Not because the signs weren't there, but because seeing them would have required him to act on them, and acting on them would have meant watching his daughter's life come apart at the seams. And there is a particular kind of cowardice that lives inside a father's love, the kind that chooses not to look because looking means being the one who has to say it. I stood up and faced the mirror on June's vanity. 71 years old. The face of a man who had outlasted recessions and ice storms and a business that had nearly broken twice and come back both times. I had not fallen apart then. I was not going to fall apart now, not in this room. Not in front of June's dried flowers and her unfinished book and her slippers by the door. She had not built me for that, and neither had the road. My personal phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Caleb, my younger son, 34 years old, a family physician in Ironwood City. 3 words. Can we talk? I hadn't told Caleb anything, which meant he had found something on his own. Caleb arrived at 7, the way he always does. No knock, just the sound of his key in the lock and his voice coming down the hallway: "Dad." I had given him a key when he finished his residency and moved back to Ironwood City. That was 6 years ago. He had never abused it, never walked in unannounced at an inconvenient hour, never treated it as anything other than the thing it was permission to enter without formality. Because formality between a father and son who have both lost the same woman is a waste of the time you have left. He came into the living room with his medical bag over one shoulder, still in the dark green fleece he wore under his coat on cold shifts. 34 years old, and there were still moments the way he set his bag down, the way he looked around a room before he spoke, where I saw June so clearly it was like looking through glass at something on the other side. I had not turned on the television. There was one reading lamp on low in the corner. We sat across from each other the way people sit when they have something real to say and don't want anything else competing for the space. "You texted me," I said. "What did you want to talk about?" He was quiet for a moment. Caleb has always been careful with words, not hesitant, just precise. He became a doctor for the same reason he had been good at everything that required careful attention. He understood that the gap between what someone says and what they mean is where most of the important information lives. "In January," he said, "I was at the Gaines Freight office visiting you. You weren't there, you were in the yard with Ted. I was in the conference room waiting, and I saw a folder on the table. A billing statement from something called Crestwood Advisory Group, out of Cheyenne, Wyoming." He paused. "I asked Conrad about it later. He said it was a legal consulting firm handling some regulatory work for a new terminal you were opening in Wyoming. And you believed him," I said, so I had no reason not to. He said it without defense, just as a fact. "But last week I was helping you sort through some of the older files in the spare room, you remember. You'd asked me to help reorganize the filing cabinet, and I found 3 more statements from the same company. Different dates, larger amounts, and Dad..." He leaned forward slightly. "I called the Wyoming Business Registry. There's no record of a terminal project. There's no record of any Gaines Freight expansion filing in that state at all." I let the room stay quiet for a moment. "You went that far," I said. "You taught me to check the work," he said. "That's what you always told me. Don't trust the summary. Go to the source." He was right. I had told him that. I had said it about homework, and later about medical school, and later still about reading lab results. It was the same principle every time. The document that matters is the one behind the document you were given. I looked at him for a moment. Then I asked the question I had been carrying since that morning. "Caleb, when you did my annual physical last spring, did Conrad ever ask you about the results?" He went still. Not dramatically, just the particular stillness of someone whose mind has shifted gears without warning. "Once," he said. "He called the office a few days after your appointment, said he'd been worried about you since Mom died, that he wanted to make sure you were taking care of yourself." He paused. "I told him your numbers were good, that everything looked normal." "That's all you told him?" "That's all there was to tell. You were fine." I nodded slowly. I did not explain why I had asked. I could see Caleb filing the question away, turning it over, beginning to connect it to the Crestwood statements in a way that hadn't occurred to him yet. That was fine. He would get there. Caleb always got there. I told him what I could. Not all of it I had learned early in my career, that you share information in proportion to what someone needs to act, not in proportion to what you know. I told him I had concerns about certain financial transactions and that I had hired someone to look into them. I told him the name Vivien Cross and described her background in broad terms: former federal investigator, now independent, experienced in cases where money moved in ways designed not to be followed. I did not tell him about the video. Not yet. What I needed from him was specific. "I need you to get my complete medical file from Dr. Howell's office," I said. "Sandra Howell, she's been my physician for 12 years. I need the original records, not a printed summary. The source documents." "Doctor." Sandra Howell had been my family doctor since the year after June's first diagnosis. She was methodical and direct, and kept notes the way a good dispatcher keeps a manifest, thorough time stamped. Nothing left to interpretation. I trusted her records the way I trusted Roy behind a wheel completely and without reservation. Caleb studied me. "Dad, are you sick?" "No," I said, "but someone may be trying to make it look like I am." He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I could hear the heating unit cycle on in the basement, the same sound that had filled this house on quiet evenings for 30 years, a sound so familiar it usually didn't register at all. Tonight it did. Then he nodded. "Tell me what you need." That was Caleb. No unnecessary questions. No performance of shock or outrage. Just the clear-eyed steadiness of a man who understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was listen and then act. June would have recognized it in him. It was the same thing she had always done for me. I walked him to the door. He picked up his bag, pulled on his coat, and then stopped with his hand on the doorframe. "Dad, Conrad called me last week. Asked how your memory's been lately." I said nothing, but inside what had been a question finished becoming something else entirely. The morning after Caleb left, I went into my home office and started going through the files on my desk, not to read them, but to decide which ones to leave there. The room was exactly as I had arranged it 3 days earlier. That was important, not a single thing out of place, not a drawer left open a fraction of an inch more than it should be. I had spent 20 minutes on Sunday afternoon repositioning every folder, every stack, every loose page to exactly where it had been before I began. Conrad had been in this room for 14 minutes on Monday morning. The room needed to look like Conrad had never been here at all. I started with the surface of the desk. 3 folders arranged at a slight angle the way papers accumulate naturally when you work at a desk every day. Not in a neat stack, but in the particular disorder of someone who knows where everything is, even when it looks like they don't. I had learned a long time ago that a desk that looks too organized makes people suspicious. A desk that looks lived in makes people comfortable. Comfortable people stop paying attention. Then the drawers. The top drawer was what it had always been: pens, paper clips, a small flashlight I kept for power outages, an address book I hadn't updated since 2009 because everyone I needed to reach was already in my phone. Conrad had opened it, I had seen that on the camera feed, and left it alone. Nothing there had interested him. The middle drawers were the heart of it. 3 months ago, when I had first started to understand that something was wrong, I had made a quiet decision. I gathered every document that actually mattered: the current company contracts, the operating agreement for Gaines Freight, my will, the account statements for everything connected to my personal finances, and I moved them out of this office. Caleb kept them in his medical building, in a locked filing cabinet, in his private office. I had chosen Caleb over Roy for a specific reason. A doctor's office has its own security infrastructure, its own professional confidentiality, and Conrad had never shown the slightest interest in Caleb's workplace. It was as close to invisible as I could get. What remained in the drawers of this desk was a carefully constructed version of nothing. Old quarterly reports. The kind of dense formatted documents that look significant at a glance and reveal very little on close reading. Copies of contracts that had expired 2 or 3 years ago, unsigned, worth nothing in a courtroom. A folder of correspondence so routine it could have been published in a company newsletter, and in the upper middle drawer, the one Conrad had gone to with the most purpose, the one whose contents he had photographed, and removed a thick manila envelope sealed with a metal clasp, with the words "Legal Reserve Q3 Summary" printed in block letters on the front. Inside that envelope was a 12-month wall calendar from the previous year. Nothing else. I had prepared it on the Thursday before, took a calendar off the wall in the spare bedroom, folded it once to fit, slid it into the envelope, sealed the clasp, and placed the envelope in the upper middle drawer where Conrad would find exactly what he was looking for. The question some people would ask is, Why didn't Conrad open the envelope right there in the office? He had a flashlight. He had time. The answer is that Conrad is a lawyer, and lawyers do not open sealed documents in the dark, in the middle of the night, in someone else's house. They take them, secure them, and examine them in a controlled environment where they can think clearly and document what they find. Opening a sealed envelope on site would have meant evidence of tampering if anything went to court. Conrad would have thought of that. His caution was in its way one of the things I was counting on. He had spent 14 minutes in this room taking a document that would tell him exactly nothing. He did not know that yet. That was the point. I thought about how he would approach it, probably that same evening or the next morning, sitting at his own desk, with coffee breaking the seal with a letter opener the way lawyers do, unfolding the contents carefully. The moment when he pulled out a calendar from last year instead of a financial summary, his expression would be the one thing I would have given a great deal to see. But that moment was his problem. Mine was this room. I went through every drawer one more time. Every folder was checked against the position I had photographed with my phone on Sunday. Every stack of papers was squared to within the same margin. I was not doing this for Conrad's benefit. I was doing it because the work required it. Because a plan that depends on the other side not knowing they've been outmaneuvered only holds if you maintain the illusion completely down to the last centimeter. Conrad needed to believe he had found something. He needed to believe he was still ahead. A man who believes he is ahead does not run. He consolidates. He takes his time. He makes the next move according to his schedule, not someone else's. And while he was doing that, Vivien was still working. I locked the desk when I was finished, turned the key, and heard the catch settle into place. It was not a necessary gesture in any practical sense. The documents inside were worthless. But there is something about locking a thing that reminds you it belongs to you. That room, that desk, that lock mine. He had come into my house believing I was asleep. He had left with a decoy, and he had no idea I had been watching every second of it. That afternoon, a message came through on the burner phone. Vivien Cross. 2 words, found it. I drove to Roy's house without stopping once. Before I tell you what Vivien found after 3 weeks of working in silence, the numbers, the names, and the truth I didn't want to believe was real. Drop the number 8 in the comments, so I know you're still here with me. A note. What comes next contains some fictional elements added for storytelling and educational purposes. If that's not the journey you're looking for, it's okay to stop here. Vivien Cross didn't waste words. She had a folder open on the table before I even sat down. She was exactly as Roy had described her when he first put us in contact 3 weeks ago, compact and still. The kind of person who takes up less space than they actually occupy, because all their attention is directed outward rather than inward. Vivien possessed exactly the kind of unyielding focus you would expect from a former federal agent specializing in financial fraud. She sat across from Roy and me with 3 stacks of documents on the table and the expression of someone about to read a weather report. "I'll go in order," she said. Financial first. The company was called Crestwood Advisory Group. Registered in Cheyenne, Wyoming, through the Wyoming Secretary of State's office, a state chosen specifically because Wyoming has among the most permissive business registration laws in the country. Minimal disclosure requirements. No requirement to list the names of beneficial owners in public filings. The registered agent was a law firm that processes hundreds of such incorporations annually and asks no questions beyond what the paperwork requires. The sole listed principal was a man named Brendan Hale, Conrad's younger brother, an accountant based in Cheyenne who, according to Vivien's research, had no clients of record, no professional website, and no verifiable business activity beyond serving as the named officer of 3 similarly structured LLCs over the past 4 years. Crestwood has no employees, Vivien said. No office address beyond a registered agent mailbox. No contracts, no service agreements, no deliverables of any kind in any public record. It exists on paper and nowhere else. What it did have was a bank account. And into that account, over a period of 9 months between August of 2022 and April of 2023, a total of $420,000 had been transferred from the Gaines Freight Legal Reserve account. The transfers had been structured carefully. Under federal banking law specifically, the Bank Secrecy Act, financial institutions are required to file a currency transaction report for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000. To avoid triggering additional scrutiny, Conrad had not moved the money in large wire transfers. Instead, each monthly movement had been broken into multiple smaller transactions, none of which individually crossed the reporting threshold. This practice, deliberately structuring transactions to avoid federal reporting requirements, is itself a federal crime, separate from and in addition to whatever fraud underlies it. He wasn't just stealing, Vivien said. He was structuring. That's a Title 31 violation. It carries its own penalties independent of the underlying conduct. Of the $420,000 received by Crestwood, Brendan Hale had retained 33,608%, paid to himself in a series of small transfers over the same period. The remaining amount had been wired to an account at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. Vivien had identified the receiving institution, but had not yet been able to trace the ultimate destination of those funds. "The Cayman account is the wall," she said. "I can see the money went in. I can't yet see where it went from there. But the structure of the transfers, the timing, the amounts, it's consistent with funds being held for future use rather than spent, and whoever controls that account was waiting for something." Roy set his coffee cup down. He didn't say anything. Vivien moved to the second stack. Conrad was preparing a conservatorship petition. In American law, a conservatorship, sometimes called a guardianship of the estate, is a court proceeding in which a judge determines that an individual lacks the mental or physical capacity to manage their own financial affairs. If granted, the court appoints a conservator who takes legal control of the subject's assets and finances. The conservator makes decisions about property accounts and business interests on the subject's behalf. The target in this case was Walter Gaines, the intended conservator, based on the documents Vivien had located through Conrad's professional filing history and communications with the Wyoming attorney who had been assisting him. Was Conrad himself acting through Diane in her capacity as CEO? "Does Diane know about this?" I asked. Vivien answered without hesitation. "Oh, she knows Conrad has been planning something related to the company's future leadership. Based on what I can establish, she's aware he's been working on what he described to her as a succession framework, a legal structure for transitioning control of Gaines Freight. She doesn't know about Crestwood. She doesn't know about the money. And she doesn't know the legal mechanism Conrad is actually building." She paused. What she knows and what's actually happening are two very different things. I looked at Roy. Roy looked at the table. Vivien turned to the third stack. She unfolded a printed page, not a newspaper, but a copy of a 2016 article from a Nashville legal trade publication. The headline concerned a civil complaint filed against the estate of a retired manufacturer, 74 years old, who had signed over 90% of his assets to a series of holding entities over an 18-month period beginning in 2014. The assets had been transferred through a series of voluntary asset transfer agreements contracts that on their face bore every appearance of freely given consent. The attorney who had structured and executed those transfers was listed in the complaint as a material witness. His name was Conrad Hale. No criminal charges had been filed. The civil complaint had been settled out of court under a confidentiality agreement. Conrad had not been disbarred, had not lost his license, had not faced a formal disciplinary hearing. What he had done was legal enough technically that the system had not been able to hold him. He had left his Nashville practice the following year. By the time the dust had fully settled in Tennessee, he was already in Ironwood City, where he had met Diane. "He didn't stumble into your family, Walter," Vivien said. She said it without drama, the way she said everything as a data point, not an accusation. "He chose it." I looked at the photograph on the printed page. Conrad, 7 years younger in a suit that fit him well, standing outside what appeared to be a courthouse, smiling the way people smile when they know a camera is on them. "Diane doesn't know this part," I said. I said it slowly, to myself as much as to the room. Not a question. A clarification for my own benefit, so I would not confuse the two things when I needed to think clearly about her. "She knows he has a plan. She doesn't know he has done this before." Roy said nothing. He understood the distinction. Vivien closed the last folder and placed both hands flat on top of it. "There's one more thing," she said. "He paid someone, a doctor. $18,500 transferred to a private account belonging to a Dr. Philip Weston licensed in another state. I don't yet know what the payment was for, but I will." I drove home alone that evening. Somewhere on the road between Roy's house and Pinecrest Ridge, something shifted in the way I was holding all of this. It stopped being about $420,000. It stopped being about Gaines Freight. It became about something that sat much closer to the center of a man, the part of him that exists before the company, before the money, before everything he built, the part that has only his name on it and nothing else. Loretta Sims had retired from the bench 4 years ago. She still kept an office because, as she had told me once, retirement is for people who no longer have anything worth fighting for. The office was on the 4th floor of the Meridian Building, 6 blocks from the Ironwood City Courthouse, where she had spent 22 years as a civil court judge. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 3 walls, the kind that actually hold books, rather than serve as decoration case reporters, statutory compilations, treatises on estate law and elder rights that were dense enough to use as ballast. Her desk was dark walnut broad and almost entirely clear. A woman who had presided over thousands of hearings had learned that the papers you leave out are the ones you're still thinking about, and Loretta Sims did not leave things unfinished. She had been referred to me by Vivien 6 years ago, at the tail end of a complicated IRS matter involving a freight broker. Roy had worked with a situation I had never asked the full details of, and Roy had never offered. What I knew was that Loretta had been the attorney who untangled it, and that Vivien had said simply, "She is the person you want when the other side is better funded and thinks they have more time than you do." I had kept her name in the back of my mind for 6 years. It turned out I had needed it. Roy sat in the chair near the window without speaking. That was Roy's contribution to proceedings like this, his presence, which was not a small thing. A man who has spent 30 years moving freight through difficult conditions develops a quality of steadiness that a room can feel without anyone naming it. Roy provided ballast. I was grateful for it. I laid everything out for Loretta in the order it had happened. The delayed account statement in August, the decision to hire Vivien, the camera installation, the lock change, the 3 weeks of surveillance. The video from Monday morning, 2:53:14 minutes. Conrad with a silver flashlight at my desk. Vivien's findings. Crestwood, Brendan Hale. $420,000 moved in structured transactions over 9 months, the Cayman account. The $18,500 paid to a Dr. Philip Weston, and Tennessee. Loretta listened to all of it without writing a single word. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen beside it, and neither moved. This was, I would later understand, how she listened when she was doing the real work. No notes, because notes interrupted the larger pattern she was assembling in her mind. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked exactly one question. "Has he filed anything yet?" "Not as far as we can determine," I said. "Then we still have time." She picked up her pen and set it down again without using it. "Not a great deal of time, but enough if we move correctly." She explained conservatorship the way a doctor explains a diagnosis, plainly without softening it into something it wasn't. Under Ohio law, a conservatorship of the estate is a court-supervised arrangement in which a judge, upon finding that an individual lacks the capacity to manage their own financial affairs, appoints a conservator to handle those affairs on the individual's behalf. The legal standard requires clear and convincing evidence, typically medical testimony, that the subject cannot adequately manage property contracts or financial decisions. Once granted, the conservator holds legal authority that supersedes the subject's own. The subject cannot enter contracts, cannot sell or transfer assets, cannot make financial decisions of any kind without the conservator's approval. In practical terms, Loretta said, "It is a cage built from court orders and medical records. The door locks from the outside, and once it closes, it is very difficult to open from within." She let that sit for a moment. Roy shifted in his chair. I did not. "Conrad's strategy," she continued, "is straightforward in its architecture. He needed two things: a medical record showing cognitive decline and a legal mechanism to exploit it. The payment to this Dr. Weston appears to be the medical component. If Weston produced a fraudulent psychiatric or neurological evaluation, one that manufactured evidence of impairment that doesn't exist, that evaluation becomes the foundation of the conservatorship petition. And if the petition is granted through a fraudulent evaluation," I asked, "then you lose control of Gaines Freight, your personal accounts, your real property, and every financial decision that remains in your life potentially permanently, depending on how the order is written." She said it without inflection. "Conrad, acting through Diane as CEO, would effectively control everything you have built." I looked at the window behind her. 6 blocks away, the courthouse where she had spent 22 years. I thought about what it would mean to walk into that building as the subject of a conservatorship petition, my name on a filing that described me as a man no longer capable of deciding what to do with the 48 years of work behind me. "What about Dr. Weston?" I asked. "The payment Vivien found." Loretta nodded slowly. "If Conrad paid a physician to produce a fraudulent medical evaluation for use in a legal proceeding that is not a civil matter, that is healthcare fraud under federal law. Title 18, Section 1347. It is also obstruction of justice if the evaluation was intended for use in court, and depending on how it was structured, it may constitute conspiracy. The physician involved faces criminal exposure as well." She folded her hands on the desk. "But I need documentation. I need the evaluation itself, the fraudulent version, and I need Dr. Howell's original records to establish the baseline. Without both, we have a suspicious payment and nothing to attach it to." "Caleb is working on the records," I said. "Good. Tell him to move quickly." She stood and walked to the window. Below, Ironwood City was going about its Wednesday morning traffic, moving. A delivery truck, idling at a corner, ordinary life, proceeding at its ordinary pace. "You've been in the freight business 48 years, Walter," she said, without turning around. "You know what a load limit is. Conrad has been running this truck overloaded for 2 years. Something is going to give. The question is whether it gives on your terms or his." Roy made a small sound that might have been agreement. I said nothing. I was thinking about load limits, about what happens to a frame when the weight exceeds what it was built to carry, and how you know, if you've driven long enough, when the road is about to collect what it's owed. I left her office 40 minutes later with a list of 3 things she needed within 72 hours. The first 2 were straightforward, the video properly documented, and Vivien's financial analysis formatted for court presentation. The third required Caleb. And I already knew, from the look on his face when he had stopped at my door 2 nights ago, that Caleb had found something he hadn't told me yet. Something he was still deciding whether to say. Caleb came back on Wednesday evening with 2 folders tucked under his arm and the expression of a man who had spent the better part of 2 days deciding how much to say. I heard his key in the front door at 8:29 p.m. I was already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I hadn't touched the overhead light on for the first time in 3 nights. The kitchen felt different at night, with the light on smaller, somehow like the walls had moved a few inches inward. He set both folders on the table and pulled out the chair across from mine. He didn't take off his jacket. "I want to start with the second folder," he said. "But you need the first one first." He opened the first folder and slid a printed photograph toward me, a side-by-side comparison. On the left, a scanned copy of a medical assessment form. On the right, a screenshot from Dr. Sandra Howell's secure electronic record system pulled directly from her office database. Caleb walked me through 4 specific differences. The MOCA score, a standardized cognitive test, had been changed from 27 to 19. A score of 27 indicates normal cognition. A score of 19 suggests moderate cognitive impairment, the kind that would concern a court. A clinical note had been added that did not exist in Dr. Howell's original patient demonstrated spatial temporal disorientation during examination, unable to correctly identify current month or recall recent appointments. Dr. Howell had written no such thing. I have been recalling appointments without a calendar for 48 years. A missed medication notation appeared in the altered version, a suggestion that I had been non-compliant with a blood pressure prescription. I have not missed a dose in 6 years. Dr. Howell's record confirmed it. A minor adjustment had been made to a blood panel result. Not enough to trigger alarm on its own. Enough combined with the other changes to build a picture. "Who had access to this form?" I asked. Caleb looked at the table for a moment. The original lives in Dr. Howell's system, it's locked, encrypted, only accessible by her staff. But the assessment copy that gets forwarded to outside parties for legal or insurance purposes, that one passes through an intermediary, anyone Conrad designates, or bribes. I looked at the side-by-side again. Someone had taken a real document and made careful, targeted edits. Not sloppy, not rushed. The kind of changes a person makes when they understand exactly what a judge looks for in a competency petition. I set the photograph face down on the table. "Open the second folder," I said. The second folder was thinner. 3 printed pages. Caleb explained that in August 2023, Diane had opened an email on the family laptop, the one she and Conrad shared when visiting Ironwood City. Conrad had left the browser open. The email was from a legal services firm in Nashville. The subject line read, "Re-Asset Control Framework Gains Estate." Diane read it. The email referenced a competency assessment timeline, a corporate transition structure, and what it called a voluntary conservatorship pathway. Diane had not understood all of it. What she understood was enough to unsettle her. She did not tell me. She told Caleb once, briefly in late August, framing it as a question. "Is Dad okay?" Conrad mentioned something about a legal review of the company. Caleb had reassured her, not yet knowing what he was reassuring her about. She did not know about Crestwood Advisory Group. She did not know about the $420,000. She did not know that a man named Dr. Philip Weston had been paid $18,500 to produce a medical assessment bearing my name with numbers that did not belong to me. What she knew was a fragment, a corner of a much larger picture shown to her by a man who made sure she could only see that much. I stood up and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet. A neighbor's porch light, a car parked 2 houses down the maple tree that had lost most of its leaves 3 weeks ago. Caleb said quietly, "She called me again last week." Her tone was different. Different how? He paused, like she'd made a decision she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I stood at that window for a while. There is a particular kind of weight that comes from learning your child was placed between two things she didn't fully understand. Diane had not betrayed me. She had been positioned carefully, deliberately, so that her silence looked like complicity and her loyalty looked like a choice she had made freely. It was neither. I turned back to the table. "I'm filing with the state medical board tonight," I said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." Caleb nodded once like he had expected that answer. He had brought a third page, a pre-drafted complaint template, filled in with the specific alterations, the document source, and Dr. Weston's name and license number. He slid it across the table. "You'll need to sign it," he said. "I can't file on your behalf. It has to come from you as the patient." I picked up a pen from the side of the table, the same spot where June used to leave her grocery lists, and signed at the bottom. "In the State Medical Board of Ohio accepts complaints online any hour of the day or night." I filed at 9:47 p.m. from the kitchen table, Caleb beside me, the 2 folders still open in front of us. After I submitted, I closed the laptop. Caleb gathered his folders, put on his coat, and stopped at the door. "Dad," he said. Then he stopped. "I know," I said. He left. I heard his car pull out of the driveway and waited until the sound faded before I moved. I stood in the kitchen alone and thought about a Tuesday morning in September 1994 when Diane was 8 years old and June had a doctor's appointment and I had a freight run I couldn't cancel. I brought Diane along. She sat in the cab of a Peterbilt 379 for 6 hours with a book on her lap and a thermos of hot chocolate, never once complaining, watching the road the way her mother watched people. I had trusted her with the cab. I had trusted her with the company. I had trusted her eventually with everything I had built. Trust, once given to the people who matter, is not a transaction. It doesn't ask to be returned, but it is the hardest thing in the world to rebuild once the space between two people has been filled with something else. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. By Sunday, every piece was in position. All that remained was deciding how to use them. Roy had cleared the coffee table sometime before 4 o'clock, moved the magazines, the remote control, the small ceramic bowl he'd kept there since Margaret passed. In its place, Vivien's laptop, Loretta's leather briefcase laid flat and open, Caleb's folder with the medical records, and my tablet with the 14-minute video still cued to the beginning. 5 chairs pulled close. 1 table, 1 direction. Vivien spoke first, the way she always did, without preamble. She confirmed that Brendan Hale's location in Cheyenne had been independently verified and that the financial flow diagram was court-ready origin pathway and the full structuring pattern mapped and documented. Everything we had discussed at Roy's table 3 days earlier was now formatted for a judge. "Structuring is a federal offense under Title 31, Loretta said, not looking up from her notes. "Even if the Cayman account stays sealed, the pattern of transfers alone is prosecutable." Vivien nodded. "Conrad knows that, which is why he needed the conservatorship in place before anyone started asking questions." Caleb went next. He set his folder on the table and spoke in the measured tone he uses when he's delivering difficult information to a patient, the voice that doesn't rush, doesn't soften, just moves forward. "The State Medical Board received the complaint filing Wednesday night," he said. "They opened a preliminary review Thursday morning. During the intake period, which typically runs 5 to 10 business days, the subject of the complaint is not notified. The board doesn't make contact at this stage. They review documentation only. I asked the question I needed answered before anything else that evening. Can Weston reach Conrad before tomorrow morning? Caleb shook his head. Not through official channels. The board won't issue a formal investigation order before Tuesday at the earliest. Weston won't know anything has been filed until that order arrives, and it arrives by certified mail, not by phone call. And informally, Weston doesn't know Conrad's name is connected to this. The complaint names Weston as the subject. Conrad is referenced only as the party who arranged payment. Weston would have to know to call Conrad, and right now Weston has no reason to think a complaint exists. I looked at Loretta. She said 12 hours, from tonight until 9:22 tomorrow morning. That's enough, I said. Loretta took the next 20 minutes. She had done this before, not this specific case, but the architecture of it. A judge for 11 years, then 4 years in elder law, she understood how these things collapsed, and she understood what held them together. The confrontation would take place at the main Gaines Freight Warehouse on Caldwell Industrial Road. Not my home, a place of business. My place of business carries a different legal weight. Conrad had a standing Monday morning management meeting at the warehouse, a schedule I had established 3 years ago, and he had never questioned. He would arrive expecting a routine meeting. He would find something else. The evidence would be presented in sequence. First, the 14-minute video from the night of the break-in, Conrad's face, Conrad's ring, Conrad's 14 minutes going through my desk. Second, Vivien's financial diagram, the 9 transfers. Brendan's 8%, the Crestwood shell, the structuring pattern. Third, the medical records, the altered assessment bearing my name alongside Dr. Sandra Howell's certified original, the 4 specific discrepancies documented and signed by Caleb as my treating physician. Fourth, the Tennessee file, the 2016 Nashville case, the 74-year-old entrepreneur, the voluntary asset transfer, the quiet departure. Conrad would be asked to sign 3 documents. The first, a repayment agreement for $420,000 structured over 18 months, with interest secured against his personal assets. The second, a formal resignation from all advisory, fiduciary, and consulting roles connected to Gaines Freight, or any Gaines family trust. The third, a written commitment witnessed and notarized, that no conservatorship petition bearing my name would be filed in any jurisdiction by Conrad or any party acting on his behalf. And if he refuses, Roy asked. It was the first thing Roy had said since the meeting started. Loretta folded her hands on the table. Then we file? Criminal referral on the structuring, fraud on the court. For the document he submitted to the Nashville attorney, and a formal elder abuse complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's office. We have enough for all 3. The room was quiet for a moment. I confirmed the trap. He took the decoy file, I said. He has 14 pages from a 2022 wall calendar inside an envelope marked Legal Reserve Q3 Summary. As of Thursday, his Nashville attorney has a copy. Loretta allowed herself a small, precise nod. Which means tomorrow morning, Conrad will walk into that warehouse believing he holds documentation that gives him leverage. He will be wrong. And when a man walks into a negotiation convinced he has the advantage, he telegraphs his entire position before he says a single word. Caleb looked at me. I looked at the table. The meeting ended just before 9. Vivien closed her laptop and packed her file box without ceremony. Loretta snapped her briefcase shut, shook my hand once, and said she'd be at the warehouse by 8:50. Caleb squeezed my shoulder on his way out the same way he did at his mother's funeral and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful left to say. Roy and I sat in the living room after they left. The table was cleared again. 2 cups of coffee, both going cold. Roy said, "Well, June would have been proud of you." I didn't answer right away. I let that sit where it landed, which was somewhere between my sternum and the back of my throat. After a while, I said, "I'll let you know at 9:23 tomorrow morning." I drove home in the dark headlights, cutting through the November fog on Route 9. The Chevy's engine ran steady and low the way it always does in cold weather. No complaint, no hesitation, just the road and the sound of it moving forward. I thought about Conrad. Somewhere in Ironwood City right now, he was likely reviewing what he believed were my estate documents. He was likely satisfied. He had the video footage from the house on his phone, he thought. He had the legal reserve summary, he thought. He had 14 months of careful preparation, a brother in Wyoming, a doctor on retainer, and a daughter who hadn't said no. He thought he was ahead. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I got home from Roy's at 10:30. I didn't go upstairs. I walked through the front door, set my keys on the hall table where they always go, and moved to the living room, to the same sofa, the same cushion, the same corner where I had sat 4 nights ago, waiting for a motion sensor to tell me what I already suspected. Tonight there was no tablet, no camera feed, no sensor set to vibrate under my palm. The room was dark, except for the porch light bleeding through the curtains, and the only thing I was waiting for was morning. I sat down and let the quiet settle around me the way it does after 11 o'clock in November. The furnace cycling on and off, the wind moving through the maple out front. The particular kind of silence that belongs to a house that used to have more people in it. I have never prepared for a difficult thing by talking myself through it. I prepare the way I always have, by sitting still and letting what matters come forward on its own. What came first was June. Not June in the way I usually remember her at the kitchen table, or standing in the doorway of Diane's old bedroom, with a look that said she already knew what I was about to say. This time it was June in the hospital. The last 11 weeks. There was an afternoon near the end, when the room was quiet, and the light through the window was the flat, pale kind that belongs to early spring, and she was holding my hand with less strength than she'd had the week before. She looked at me for a long time before she said it. "Don't let the company be the only thing you love, Walter." I smiled. I thought she was talking about my hours, my habit of leaving before 6 and coming home after 8, my tendency to answer the phone during dinner and call it a necessity. I thought she meant the business in the way she sometimes pushed back on it, gently, consistently, across 41 years. She wasn't talking about the business. She was talking about Diane. I understand that now, sitting in the dark on a Sunday night in November 2023, with 6.5 hours left before the most consequential morning of the past 4 decades. June knew the way she always knew things slightly, before I was ready to hear them, that I had built Gaines Freight into something substantial enough to become a reason to keep people at arm's length. That a man who is always building has a convenient excuse for never just sitting with the people he built it for. She wasn't warning me about overwork. She was warning me that Diane needed a father more than she needed a company, and that if I confused the two, I would lose both. The second memory came up slowly, the way water rises, no rush, no force, just the natural movement of something that's been waiting. Diane was 8 years old. It was a Tuesday night in late October. I don't remember the year exactly, but I remember the temperature, which was in the low 40s, and I remember the route, which ran west out of Ironwood City toward the Indiana line and back. A short run. 6 hours at most. She had asked to come along. June had said no first, then I had overruled it, which June allowed me to do approximately once per quarter without comment. Diane had promised to sleep. She was asleep within 40 minutes of us leaving the yard, curled against the passenger door of the Peterbilt, with her jacket pulled over her like a blanket, one sneaker half on one hand tucked under her cheek. I drove for 3 hours in the dark, with my daughter sleeping beside me, and thought nothing about contracts or quarterly figures or fleet maintenance schedules. I thought, this is why I drive. Not for the loads, not for the margins. For the fact that this child trusts me enough to fall asleep while the road moves underneath her. That child is 37 years old now. She runs the company I built. She married a man I welcomed into my home, into my business, into the family meeting, where I introduced him to every person whose livelihood depends on the decisions we make together. And that man spent 14 months building a legal structure designed to remove me from everything I spent 48 years constructing, using my daughter as the instrument, because he understood that she was the one thing I would never move against directly. Tomorrow, I am going to sit across a table from him and dismantle what he built. Not because of the money is recoverable. Not because of the legal mechanism, the conservatorship petition was never filed and will never be filed now. I am going to do it because of the 8-year-old asleep in the cab of that Peterbilt. Because what a father owes his daughter is the truth, even when she doesn't know yet that she needs it. I have been asked by Roy, by Loretta, and in a different way by myself, why I chose not to pursue criminal charges. The answer is not complicated. If Conrad is convicted of a federal offense, Diane spends the next several years as the wife of a convicted felon. Sophie grows up with that attached to her name, to her father's name, to every form she fills out and every question she answers. I will not do that to them. Conrad leaving is sufficient. Conrad gone, the money returned, the legal threat neutralized. That is what protection looks like. It is quieter than justice, but it lasts longer. The clock on the mantel read 2:53 a.m. I looked at it for a moment. 4 nights ago, at exactly this hour, a motion sensor had vibrated under my hand, and I had lifted a tablet screen in the dark to find out who was moving along the south side of my house. I had already known, in the way you know things you aren't ready to act on yet. But that was the moment the knowing became something I couldn't set aside. Now it was 2:53 a.m. on a different night, and Conrad Hale was somewhere in Ironwood City, most likely asleep, most likely satisfied, most likely reviewing in his mind a set of documents he believed gave him a position of strength. For the first time since I had sat down, I felt something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. In 6 hours and 29 minutes, that would change. I closed my eyes at 3 o'clock. Not to sleep. A man who has been running freight since 1972 knows the difference between rest and sleep. One restores the body, the other restores the judgment. I needed the second kind. I needed to sit in the dark behind my own eyelids and let the morning come toward me at its own pace without reaching for it. The furnace cycled once. The wind moved through the maple. The house was quiet in the way it is when it has nothing left to ask of you. I let the morning come. Everything was in position. The footage, the financial records, the falsified medical file. And that man was walking through the door at 9:20 Monday morning, still believing he held the advantage. Comment ready if you want to see what happens next. Please note some elements of this story are fictional, reconstructed for storytelling and educational purposes. If this isn't the content you're looking for, you can turn it off right here. I arrived at the warehouse at 7 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours and 22 minutes before the meeting. I wanted to know the room before anyone else walked into it. I had driven the Chevy, not the company truck, the Chevy. It felt right to arrive in something that had been with me longer than most of the decisions I was about to make. The warehouse floor was already moving when I pulled in 3 dock crew running a refrigerated trailer, Ted's clipboard, visible through the loading bay window. Monday morning at Gaines Freight runs, whether I'm watching or not. That used to satisfy me more than it does now. 48 years of building something that doesn't need you to stand over it is supposed to feel like success. This morning, it just felt like time. I took the stairs to the second floor without stopping at the dock. The conference room at the top of the landing has 12 chairs, a long oak table that arrived in 1987, and windows that look down over the truck yard. I have sat at that table for budget reviews and contract negotiations and twice for conversations that ended someone's employment with the company. I know every scratch on that surface. I know which chair wobbles at the left rear leg. I know that the projector bulb runs 5 degrees hotter than it should and needs 10 minutes to stabilize. I turned on the projector. I checked the laptop connection. I arranged 6 document sets on the table face down, each one squared to the edge, each one placed at the chair it was meant for. I put Conrad's copy at the chair to my left, close enough that he would have to turn only slightly to look at me when he read it. Then I stood at the head of the table and looked at the room. This was my room. I wanted it to say that before anyone sat down. They arrived between 8:30 and 8:50 in the order we had agreed on the night before. Vivien came first, carrying her file box and a coffee she'd picked up somewhere on Caldwell Road. She set the box at her chair, sat down, and opened her laptop without a word. Vivien Cross is not a woman who fills silence with conversation, which is one of the reasons I trusted her with this. Loretta arrived 6 minutes later, leather briefcase in hand, wearing a gray blazer I had not seen before. She walked the length of the table once before sitting, the way a person does when they're reading a room they've entered for the first time. She stopped briefly at the window, looked down at the truck yard, and said, "Good location." I didn't respond. She didn't need me to. Roy and Caleb came up the stairs together at 8:42, Roy with his coffee thermos and Caleb with the medical folder that hadn't left his possession since Wednesday. Roy looked around the room the way he looks at everything, steadily, without performance. He sat in the chair 2 down from mine and set his thermos on the table. Caleb took the seat next to the empty chair, the chair I had told Diane to take. At 9 o'clock, I went down to the loading bay to find Ted. Ted Calloway is 58 years old and has worked for Gaines Freight for 31 years. He started as a dockhand the spring after I bought the second building on the Caldwell lot, and at some point in the intervening 3 decades, he became the person the floor runs through whether or not I'm present. He knows the difference between the problems he should bring to me and the problems he should solve himself. And he is right about which is which approximately 94% of the time. I told him, "Stay at the conference room door after 9:15. No one in or out." He looked at me. "Nothing wrong?" I said. "Just a meeting that needs to finish before it gets interrupted." Ted nodded once. He handed his clipboard to the nearest dockhand and followed me upstairs without asking another question. 31 years earns that kind of trust in both directions. Diane arrived at 9:13. I had called her at 6:40 that morning. I had kept it short, come to the warehouse at 9:15, sit next to Caleb. Don't speak to Conrad before the meeting starts. I had not explained. She had not asked me to. She came through the conference room door in a dark coat, her hair pulled back the way she wears it for early meetings, a travel mug in her left hand. She stopped 2 steps into the room and looked at the people in it. Vivien's laptop, Loretta's briefcase, Roy's thermos, the 6 face-down document sets on the table. Then she looked at me standing at the head of it. Her face changed. Not dramatically, Diane does not do things dramatically, which is something she got from her mother. But the color went out of it, and the professional composure she walks into every meeting with shifted into something quieter and more careful. She sat down next to Caleb. She set her travel mug on the table and did not pick it up again. She did not ask what was happening. She already knew enough to understand that the answer was coming, and that asking for it early would not make it easier. Conrad came in at 9:20. Navy suit, gray tie, leather bag over one shoulder, the complete presentation of a man who has arrived to conduct business on his own terms. He pushed the door open with the ease of someone who has entered this room before which he has, and scanned the faces at the table with the quick professional read of a lawyer taking inventory. He saw Vivien. He knew her as a financial consultant, her cover for the past 3 weeks, and his expression registered nothing beyond mild acknowledgement. He saw Loretta Sims. I watched him place her. It took approximately 3 seconds. Former civil court judge Ironwood City retired 4 years ago. Elder law practice. The calculation moved across his face the way weather moves across an open field, visible directional, and gone before you can name exactly what you saw. That was the first moment he understood that something in the room was not what he had expected. He looked at Diane. Diane was looking at the table in front of her. He looked at me. I was standing at the head of the table with both hands resting flat on the oak surface, looking back at him. "Good morning, Conrad," I said. "Sit down." He sat. Not with the ease he'd walked in with. He set his bag on the floor, pulled out the chair I had placed his document set in front of, and lowered himself into it with the careful movement of a man who has just realized the floor may not be entirely solid. He looked at the face-down papers in front of him. He looked at the projector screen, which showed nothing yet, just the white light of a machine waiting for input. He looked at Diane again. She did not look up. He looked at Roy. Roy was looking at the window. He looked at me. I nodded once at Loretta. Loretta reached forward and turned her own document set face up. She slid it to the center of the table with the deliberate motion of someone who has done this in a courtroom and is not in a hurry. She folded her hands. "Mr. Hale," she said, "we have some things we'd like you to look at." Conrad looked down at the first page. For the first time in the 9 years I had known him, 9 years of Sunday dinners and management meetings and the handshake. At the contract table where I gave him access to everything I had spent my life building, I watched the color leave his face. There are moments in a man's life when everything he has built, every decision, every early morning, every sacrifice that didn't have a name at the time he made it, converges into what he does in a single room. This was that room. This was that moment. Loretta opened without preamble. She pressed a key on the laptop, and the projector threw the footage onto the wall screen at the far end of the table. The timestamp read 2:53 a.m. The angle was wide, the south garage window, the interior hallway, the door to the home office. The figure in the dark coat entered at 2:53:41. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had thought through the space in advance. 14 minutes of footage. Loretta played it without interruption. No narration, no pauses, just the record. Conrad watched the screen. His face held. I have seen men hold their faces in difficult rooms. Before it is a skill lawyers develop the way freight brokers develop the ability to read a load board through repetition and necessity. But his hands were on the table in front of him, and at the 4-minute mark, the fingers of his right hand drew inward. When the footage ended, Conrad said, "That can be explained. Just like you can explain the 2022 wall calendar inside the Q3 summary envelope you stole," I asked. Conrad stopped. The muscles in his jaw tightened, but no words came out. Loretta folded her hands. "Everything will be explained in a moment." Vivien took over without being asked. She turned her laptop so the screen faced the center of the table and walked through the Crestwood financial diagram, the way she had walked me through it 2 weeks earlier, methodically, without editorializing, letting the numbers carry the weight. 9 transfers. August 2022 through April 2023. Each one structured below the federal reporting threshold. Total $420,000, drawn from the Gaines Freight Legal Reserve account that Conrad administered as a state attorney of record. The funds moved to Crestwood Advisory Group, a Wyoming LLC with a registered agent address in Cheyenne, no physical office, no employees, no documented business activity of any kind beyond receiving wire transfers from a single client. "Brendan handles legitimate consulting work," Conrad began. Vivien placed a single sheet on the table without looking at him. Wyoming Secretary of State filing, Crestwood Advisory Group. Date of formation 2 months before the first transfer. Listed principal Brendan Hale. No operating agreements on file. No state business license. No record of any engagement letter deliverable or contract with any party other than Gaines Freight. The room was quiet. Conrad looked at the sheet. He did not pick it up. Caleb opened his folder and placed 2 documents side by side on the table, the altered assessment and Dr. Sandra Howell's certified original, printed from her electronic record system, with her office seal at the bottom of each page. He read the discrepancies aloud in the same voice he uses when he explains a diagnosis measured precise, without inflection. MoCA score original 27, altered document 19. Clinical notation, original unremarkable cognitive screening, no concerns identified. Altered document. Patient demonstrated spatial temporal disorientation, unable to correctly identify current month or recall recent appointments. Medication compliance original. Full adherence noted across all prescriptions. Altered document missed doses flagged across a 3-month period. Blood panel original within normal range across all markers. Altered document. 1 value adjusted outside reference range flagged for follow-up. Caleb closed the folder. He looked at Conrad directly. "You weren't just trying to take his money, Conrad," he said. "You were trying to take his mind." No one at the table spoke. Outside the conference room windows, I could hear the truck yard, a backup alarm, the low idle of a diesel engine, the ordinary sounds of a Monday morning at a freight company that had been running without interruption for 48 years. Those sounds had never felt as far away as they did in the next 10 seconds. Conrad turned to Diane. "Diane." His voice shifted lower, more personal, reaching for something that had worked before. "You know I did this for us. For our future. Everything I've built has been for—" Diane was looking at the table in front of her. She did not look up. She did not answer. The sentence finished in the air and stayed there. Loretta reached into her briefcase and placed the last folder on the table. Tennessee, 2016. A 74-year-old entrepreneur in Nashville. 18 months. 90% of his assets transferred through a voluntary asset agreement, structured and administered by Conrad Hale, then practicing estate law in Davidson County. No criminal charges filed, case settled confidentially. Conrad had left Tennessee the following year. He had met Diane in Ironwood City 8 months after that. Conrad looked at the folder. The color that had left his face in the final seconds of Task 13 did not return. For a long moment, he was very still, the kind of stillness that is not calm, but is its closest neighbor. 3 minutes passed. I know because I was watching the clock on the wall above the projector screen, the same clock that has been in that room since 1991. Then Conrad said quietly, "Oh, what do you want?" It was not a question. It was a man calculating the floor. I spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. "In this business," I said, "one wrong number costs you. You can be right about everything else, every route, every contract, every hire, and one wrong number undoes the whole run." I looked at him steadily. "You went one wrong number, Conrad. In my world, that's enough." I slid the 3 documents across the table. The first, a repayment agreement for $420,000 structured over 18 months with interest, secured against his personal assets and co-signed by Brendan Hale as a party to the original transfers. The second, a formal resignation from all advisory, fiduciary, and consulting roles connected to Gaines Freight, any Gaines family trust, or any legal instrument bearing my name. The third, a written commitment notarized and witnessed that no conservatorship petition bearing my name or referencing my assets would be filed in any jurisdiction by Conrad Hale or any party acting at his direction. "Sign all 3, I said. Walk out. We don't call the prosecutor. Conrad looked at the documents. I watched him move through it, the calculation, the inventory, the assessment of what signing cost against what refusing would cost more. He was still a lawyer, even now, even in this room. He understood the structure of what was in front of him. He picked up the pen. He signed the first document, then the second, then the third. He set the pen down on the table and exhaled a slow, controlled breath, the kind a man releases when he has accepted the terms of something he cannot change. He began to push back his chair. That was when Diane reached into her bag. She placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of him. Standard legal size. No expression on her face, not anger, not grief, not the particular devastation of someone saying goodbye to 9 years. Her face was the flat, clear surface of a decision already made and no longer available for negotiation. That's from my attorney, she said. It's a legal separation filing. Loretta prepared it. I signed it this morning. Conrad looked at the envelope. He looked at Diane. In 83 minutes of that room, through video footage and financial diagrams and altered medical records and a 7-year-old case file from another state, Conrad Hale had not been without a response. He was a man who had spent his career understanding that every problem has a structure and that the structure always has a door. He had no response for this. For the first time since he had walked through the conference room door at 9:20, he had nothing to say. The room was very quiet. Outside the windows, I could hear the truck yard engines idling, the low percussion of dock work, the sound of a company that had been running since before Conrad Hale had known my daughter's name. 48 years of that sound. Through every hard winter, every market contraction, every morning I was not sure the next contract would come. I had never been as glad to hear it as I was at that moment. Conrad left the room at 10:47. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. He picked up his leather bag from the floor beside his chair, pushed back from the table, and walked to the door with the measured pace of a man who understands that the only remaining form of dignity available to him is not running. The door closed behind him. Ted's footsteps followed down the hallway stairs, not escorting, just present, the way a man with 31 years in a building knows when to be visible without being asked. The room held its breath for a moment after the latch clicked. Then Vivien reached for the nearest document set and began to organize the files with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom the work is never quite finished. She stacked the Crestwood flow diagram on top of the Tennessee folder, squared the edges, and closed her file box with a soft snap. She would spend the next 3 days writing the formal investigative report that Loretta would attach to the court filing. She knew that. She was already thinking about it. Loretta stood and turned to me. "We'll file the signed agreements with the court by end of day," she said. "Brendan Hale's cooperation has been confirmed. His attorney reached out this morning. The $420,000 should be recoverable within 30 days, possibly sooner, if the structured repayment triggers the acceleration clause." I nodded. She extended her hand, and I shook it. The handshake of two people who have done something difficult together and do not need to make more of it than it was. "Call me if anything changes," she said. "No, I will." She picked up her briefcase and left without ceremony, which is exactly how I would have wanted it. Roy was the last of the others to stand. He came around the table slowly, the way he moves when he's carrying something he doesn't want to spill, and put his hand on my shoulder for exactly the length of time it needed to be there. He didn't say anything. Roy has always understood that some moments are not improved by language. He squeezed once, then he was gone. Caleb looked at me from across the table. He had his folder back in hand, his coat already half on. "Dad," he said. "Are you all right? Give me a few minutes alone with your sister." He looked at Diane, then back at me. He nodded the way he does when he's accepting an answer he knows is sufficient even if it isn't complete. Then he followed the others out, pulling the door almost closed behind him. Not latched, just resting, giving the room a degree of privacy without sealing it off from the building's sounds. The truck yard noise filtered through the windows, an engine turning over, the hydraulic compression of a dock leveler releasing. Monday at Gaines Freight moving forward the way it always does. Diane hadn't stood up. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, her eyes on the grain of the oak surface, her travel mug untouched since she'd set it down an hour and 20 minutes ago. I pulled out the chair beside her, not across beside, and sat down the way you sit next to someone who needs company more than they need to be looked at. We stayed like that for a moment. The room was quieter now, with only 2 people in it. I didn't begin with what she had done wrong. I didn't begin with August or the email, or the 9 years of Sunday dinners with a man who had spent the last 14 months building a legal structure designed to take everything I had spent my life constructing. I had said what needed to be said to Conrad. What needed to be said to Diane was different. The day I gave you the CEO title, I said I wasn't handing you a job, Diane. I was telling you something about how I see you. She looked up. Her eyes were red at the edges, the quiet evidence of something that had been pressing from the inside for longer than this morning. I said, I know about August. I know about the email. I know how frightened you must have been. I stopped there. I'm not angry with you. Those 5 words, I counted them after, because I wanted to be sure I had said the right number, landed in the space between us, and stayed there. She looked at me the way Diane has looked at me since she was small, when she was deciding whether the thing she'd just heard was true enough to trust. Then she cried. Not the way people cry in films, not sudden, not loud, not with the complete surrender of someone whose defenses have collapsed all at once. She cried the way people cry when they have been holding something for so long that the body finally makes the decision without consulting the mind. A slow release. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Her breath came out longer than it went in. I didn't know it had gotten this bad, Dad, she said. Her voice was steady, which made it harder to hear. I kept telling myself it was just business, that he was ambitious, that he was aggressive, but not like this. Not this. I know, I said. I put my hand over hers on the table. She didn't pull back. I should have told you about the email, she said. Yes, I said. But you're here now. At some point after that, I looked out the windows at the truck yard below. A loaded flatbed was pulling out through the south gate. A dock crew was breaking down a pallet near Bay 3. The operations manager, a young man named Harris, who had been with us 4 years, was moving between the bays with a clipboard, the same way Ted moved with a clipboard 20 years ago, the same way I moved with one before that. I had not cried since the hospital. Since the spring of 2021 in a room with flat, pale light and June's hand in mine with less strength in it than the week before. I did not cry loudly now. It was not that kind of moment. It was the kind where the eyes do what they need to do, while the rest of the face remains still, where the feeling is too large to stay entirely inside, but too private to perform. I looked at the truck yard, and I let it happen, and I did not explain it to anyone. What I was looking at was not a freight operation. I was looking at Diane sitting straight-backed in the wreckage of a 9-year marriage not collapsed, not reaching for anyone to hold her up. Just present, just upright, just her. The girl who had fallen asleep in the cab of a Peterbilt at 8 years old, trusting the road and the man behind the wheel to bring her home safely. She had found her own way home, without me, in the end. That was the thing that broke me open quietly in that room with the truck yard outside the window and 48 years of freight sounds underneath it all. We sat there for a long time, long enough for the morning routes outside to cycle through and the dock to go quiet for the noon hour. When Diane finally stood up, she looked like someone who had set down something she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it wasn't part of her own body. I recognized that feeling. It had taken me 48 years to learn it. The week following that Monday moved differently than the weeks before it. Slower in certain respects, faster in others. That is the particular way time behaves after a significant thing has shifted. It takes a while for the hours to find their regular weight again. Loretta called on Wednesday afternoon with the first update. Brendan Hale had entered into full cooperation with the civil recovery process by Tuesday noon. The $420,000 would be returned within 28 days, drawn from Brendan's personal accounts, and the liquidation of Crestwood Advisory Group's remaining assets. The Wyoming LLC would be dissolved. There would be no further legal action against Brendan provided the repayment schedule held without deviation. Loretta said all of this without ceremony, the way she delivers most things, and I thanked her the same way. Conrad had left Ironwood City within 48 hours of the meeting. Roy told me this on Thursday evening when he stopped by with a bag of groceries he claimed he'd bought too much of. Roy has been bringing excess groceries to my house since June passed. I have never once believed he accidentally bought too much. He told me Conrad had returned to the apartment on the east side of the city sometime after midnight on Tuesday. Alone. No advance notice. 2 bags and a garment carrier. He had left his key on the kitchen counter and taken nothing that wasn't already his. Roy knew this because the building superintendent had called Diane on Wednesday, and Diane had told Roy, and Roy had told me. Conrad had not contacted anyone in the family directly. He had simply gone the way a problem sometimes resolves itself, not by being confronted a second time, but by removing itself from the equation entirely. Dr. Philip Weston received formal notification from the State Medical Board on Thursday of that same week. His license was placed under interim suspension, pending criminal investigation, a process that Caleb explained when he called. Accelerates when the evidence involves falsified records submitted in a legal proceeding. The investigation would take months. The suspension was immediate and entered into the public record the same afternoon. I met with Loretta twice in the following 3 weeks to establish the Family Protection Trust. The structure places the operational and asset framework of Gaines Freight, the company, its properties, its accounts, and its future interests within a legal arrangement that cannot be accessed through a conservatorship petition or voluntary asset transfer without the unanimous agreement of 3 named trustees, myself, Caleb, and a third-party corporate trustee through Loretta's firm. The threshold for any single party to act alone is set high enough to make unilateral movement functionally impossible. I also updated my will during the same period. I added Sophie as a direct beneficiary with a protected educational fund vesting in stages from 18 to 25. It took less than an hour to sign the amended documents. It was one of the better hours I have spent in a lawyer's office in 48 years of spending such hours. Diane asked if she and Sophie could stay at Pinecrest Ridge while the legal matters settled. She didn't ask right away. It was the Friday after the meeting when she called and said it plainly, without framing it as something she expected me to negotiate. I told her the second bedroom was already made up, which was true. June had kept it ready out of a habit she never explained, and I had kept it ready after June was gone out of a habit I never examined too closely. Some things you maintain not because you expect them to be used, but because stopping feels like a different kind of loss. They arrived Saturday morning with 2 suitcases, Sophie's backpack and a cardboard box. Sophie had packed herself the contents of which she declined to share with either adult. I carried the box to the second bedroom and set it on the desk without asking what was in it. Some inventories don't need taking. The first several days, Diane and I didn't talk much about what had happened. We talked about Sophie's third-grade fractions, which arrived earlier in the curriculum than either of us remembered. We talked about the November temperature, which had dropped 6 degrees below the previous year's average and showed no signs of recovering before December. We talked about the creak on the second stair from the top and whether it had always been there or whether it was something the cold had introduced. That is how 2 people begin again. Not from the large story which is too heavy to lift all at once, but from the smallest ones available, until the weight becomes something that can be carried without thinking about it. Sophie took to the backyard from the first afternoon. She is 8 years old and carries the energy of a child who has been living in a constrained space too long, tuned to open ground, the way a compass needle is tuned to north. I watched her from the kitchen window that first Saturday, moving between the maple and the back fence with no objective beyond the investigation of available territory. Children don't require an explanation for what is wrong in a house. They absorb it through the quality of silence at the dinner table, through the altered rhythm of adult voices, through the things not said in their presence that they register regardless. Sophie had been living inside a storm that had no vocabulary available to her. She was 8 years old and had no framework for what she had been breathing in for longer than she should have had to. Now the air had changed. She was running in the yard in the cold November afternoon, laughing at nothing in particular, her breath visible in short white bursts against the gray sky. That was the whole of the information I needed. Children tell you what they know in the only language available to them. Sophie was telling me she could breathe again. One evening in late November, Diane came out to the back porch while I was sitting with a coffee watching the yard go dark. She took the chair beside mine, June's chair, which hadn't been used much since 2021, and we watched Sophie move around the far end of the yard without speaking for a while. The cold was present, but not sharp. The maple had finished dropping its leaves and stood clean against the darkening sky. Then Diane said, "I'm sorry, Dad, about August." "I know," I said. A moment passed. Then, "Is that enough?" I looked out at Sophie, who had stopped near the back fence and was crouching over something in the grass with the focused attention of a scientist or an 8-year-old, the two being functionally indistinguishable in their methods. "It's a start," I said. Sophie came up the porch steps that evening at full speed, cheeks red from the cold, one hand closed around something she'd found near the fence line. She stopped at the top step and held it out to me with the gravity of someone presenting evidence that matters. Grandpa," she said, "I found a rock that looks like a truck." It did loosely a flat oval of fieldstone with a raised ridge along one edge that could, with the right kind of attention, be read as a cab set forward on a long trailer. I took it from her and turned it over in my palm. The surface was cold and slightly rough where the weathering hadn't quite finished its work. I sat with it a moment longer than the situation required. I kept it. I didn't understand why at the time. But I do now, 8 months after that Monday. Sophie came to find me in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon in August. She sat down in the grass beside my chair, the way a person sits when they have been carrying something for a long time and have finally decided that today is the day to set it down. I didn't ask what she wanted. I have learned over a long time in freight that you don't rush a load to settle. You give it the space it needs and let it find its own balance. The same principle applies to 9-year-olds with something on their minds. The garden was quiet around us. June had planted sunflowers along the south fence every summer for as long as I could remember, a habit she kept without ceremony, the way she kept most of her better habits. Diane had planted them this year in the same spots without my asking. They stood now at the edge of the yard, tall and unhurried in the August heat, turning their faces toward the afternoon light the way they always do. Sophie pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the grass between her shoes for a moment. Then she said, "Grandpa, before Christmas last year I heard Dad on the phone." I set my glass down on the arm of the chair. I sat still. She told it the way children tell things they have memorized, without meaning to, slowly, in the exact order it happened, with the particular precision that belongs to someone who doesn't yet know which details are important, and so keeps all of them. She had been in the hallway outside the home office. It was an evening in early December, she thought a Thursday, because she remembered her school bag was packed for Friday already. Her father had closed the door but not latched it, and the gap was enough. She had not been trying to listen. She had stopped because something in the tone of his voice was unfamiliar to her. and children stop for unfamiliar tones, the way animals stop for unfamiliar sounds. She had heard 4 things clearly enough to remember. The old man. That was how Conrad had referred to me. Sophie said it quietly, watching my face as she did. I kept my expression where it was, confused. Or a word close to it. She wasn't certain of the exact word, but she was certain of the meaning she had taken from it. The medical evaluation results, before he changes the will. I didn't know what all of it meant, Sophie said. She looked up at me. Her eyes were clear and steady, the eyes of a child who has been sitting with a question for 8 months and has finally found the person she trusts to answer it. But it didn't feel right. So I told Mom. She paused. That was okay, wasn't it? To tell Mom? I looked at my granddaughter. 9 years old, sitting in the summer grass with her arms around her knees, waiting for confirmation that she had done the right thing when she was 8, and the vocabulary wasn't available to her, and the only instrument she had was the instinct that something was wrong. Yes, Sophie, I said. You did exactly the right thing. She let out a breath that she had probably been holding in one form or another since December. I sat with what she had told me and let it arrange itself into the shape it had always been, now that I could see all of it. Diane had read the August email and understood enough to be frightened. But Diane is her mother's daughter. In one specific way, she does not act on fear alone. She requires confirmation. She had spent 4 months finding reasons to explain away what she had read, constructing interpretations that allowed her to stay where she was, to believe that ambition and wrongdoing were still separable things. Then Sophie had walked down the hallway in early December and stopped outside a door that wasn't quite closed. A child of 8 has no motive for invention. A child of 8 who tells her mother that she heard her father say the old man and the medical evaluation results, and before he changes the will is reporting what she heard, because that is all she knows how to do. Diane could explain away an email. She could not explain away her daughter. December. That was when she had called Vivien. I had told Roy months earlier, before any of this came to a head, that if Diane ever came to him with questions, he should point her in the right direction. Roy had given her Vivien's number. I hadn't known whether Diane would ever use it. She did. I had known the sequence in general terms. Diane contacted Vivien. Vivien began her investigation. The machinery had started moving. But I had not known what set it in motion. Not until this afternoon in the August garden, with Sophie sitting in the grass and the sunflowers standing along the south fence where June used to tend them. Sophie was the reason. Not the email, not the fear. Sophie, 8 years old, carrying a thing she didn't have language for choosing, to give it to the one person she trusted to carry it further. That was the piece I had been missing. After a while, Sophie reached into the pocket of her shorts and placed something on the grass between us. The fieldstone. Flat oval raised ridge along one edge. Cold in November, warm now from 8 months in a child's bedroom. Turned over and examined and kept for reasons she understood about, as well as I had understood mine when I first held it. I kept it because you kept it, Grandpa, she said. I thought it meant something. I picked it up. Turned it in my hand the way I had on the porch steps last November in the dark, while the November cold came in off the yard. The surface was the same. The weight was the same. I smiled, not the careful, managed expression I had worn in conference rooms and legal offices for the past year, but the kind that arrives without instruction. It does, I said. That evening, Diane came out to the garden, and the 3 of us ate dinner outside, sandwiches and lemonade, nothing prepared with any particular intention. Sophie talked about school, about a project involving maps, about a disagreement with a friend that had apparently resolved itself by Tuesday. Diane mentioned a new contract that Gaines Freight was bidding on, a regional distribution account that would add 3 routes if it came through. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. There are evenings that are complete in themselves, not because anything extraordinary happened in them, but because everything ordinary happened in exactly the right order. This was one of those evenings. I sat in the August garden with my daughter and my granddaughter and the fieldstone in my shirt pocket and let it be what it was. This time last year, I was sitting in a dark living room waiting for something to happen. This morning, I am sitting in the backyard with a cup of coffee, and the distance between those 2 mornings is everything. The yard is different in November than it is in August. The sunflowers June planted every year along the south fence, the ones Diane put in again this past spring in the same spots, without my asking, have gone the way of late-season flowers. The stalks are dry now, bent at the top, the seed heads dark and heavy. There is something I have always respected about a plant that spends its entire growing season turning toward the light and then stands its ground through the cold rather than simply disappearing. June would have told me that was a stretch of a metaphor. She was usually right about those things. I have been reaching for her corrections more than usual this past year, in the way you reach for something that isn't there anymore, and find that the reaching itself becomes a kind of conversation. The maple has started dropping in earnest. The yard is covered in yellow and brown, that Sophie has been moving through all week, with the pleasure of a 9-year-old who has discovered that fallen leaves make a satisfying sound underfoot. She informed me on Thursday that the corner near the back fence has the best concentration and that I should not rake it yet. I have not raked it yet. From somewhere beyond the tree line, I can hear the low diesel register of the Gaines Freight morning shift beginning. First trucks out of the yard at 5:40, the way they have been since 1981. 48 years of that sound. I have never once gotten tired of it. The Family Protection Trust has been in effect for 11 months. Gaines Freight's legal structure is as secure as Loretta and I could make it, considerably more secure than it was this time last year. Diane is still CEO. She has been in the role for 2 years now and has stopped asking me to review her decisions before she makes them, which is exactly what I wanted when I gave her the title. The regional distribution contract she mentioned in August came through in September. 3 new routes, 2 additional drivers, 1 more reason to keep the morning shift starting at 5:40. Caleb still calls on Sunday evenings. Roy still brings groceries he claims are accidental surplus. I used to accept these gestures the way a man accepts weather present unremarkable, requiring no acknowledgement. I understand their value differently now. The people in your life who show up consistently in small ways across years, without requiring the gesture to be noticed. I was 50 years old before I understood what that costs, and I am not certain I fully understood it until this past year. I don't know where Conrad is. I have not tried to find out. This is not because the year has softened what he did, it has not. And I am not a man who confuses time passing with debt being settled. It is because Conrad Hale is no longer part of the story I am living. The $420,000 was returned in full, the last payment arriving in early December without drama. The trust documents are signed and filed. Diane's separation is moving through the court, at the pace these things move. Conrad exists somewhere in the world that does not intersect with mine, and I have found that a person can make peace with that, not through forgiveness exactly, but through the act of turning to face a different direction and finding there is more than enough worth looking at. I finished my coffee and walked to the garage. The Chevy was where it always is, backed in on the left side, the way I have parked it since 1987. 45 years old, this truck. I bought it in 1979, 7 years after I started Gaines Freight, with a single route, a borrowed trailer, and a figure on a legal pad that represented everything I owned and was willing to lose. The truck outlasted the legal pad. It outlasted the borrowed trailer and the first building on the Caldwell lot, and 2 recessions and 1 flood. It still runs the way it should. The engine turns over on the first key in cold weather. The heater takes 4 minutes to reach temperature. The speedometer reads 2 miles per hour, optimistic at highway speed. A calibration error I identified in 1983 and have never corrected, because at this point it would feel like changing something that doesn't need changing. I didn't get in. I put my hand flat on the roof, the November metal cold under my palm. The way old paint feels when it has been through enough seasons to develop character, and stood there in the gray early light. 45 years, I said. Still running. I laughed at myself quietly in the empty garage. This is something I have been doing more often this past year, and have decided to take as a reasonable sign. I walked back out into the yard and looked at the house. Sophie's window was still dark. Diane's curtains were drawn. Two people asleep in rooms that were empty for too many years after Roy's Margaret, after June. The house going quieter floor by floor, the way houses do when the people in them are subtracted one at a time, and the remaining person learns to stop listening for footsteps that are no longer there. It is not quiet now. It has not been quiet since the Saturday morning last November, when they arrived with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box Sophie had packed herself. I have stopped noticing the difference. The way you stop noticing warmth once you have been warm long enough, not because it becomes ordinary, but because it becomes the condition you are living in, rather than the thing you are waiting for. I am 72 years old. I have 48 years in freight and a company that is structurally sound and still moving. I have a son who calls on Sundays and a brother who shows up with groceries and a lawyer I would trust with anything I own. I have a daughter running the business I spent my life building and doing it better than I expected, which is the best possible outcome for anything we build and hand to someone else. I have a granddaughter who keeps a fieldstone in her bedroom because her grandfather kept one first. And I have a yard in November, a finished cup of coffee, and the knowledge that the worst thing that happened to this family in the past 2 years did not break it. Bent it, tested the structure in ways I would not have chosen, but the structure held. That is not nothing. That is everything. From inside the house, I heard the floor creak, the second stair from the top left side, the one that announces itself in cold weather, and that I have decided not to fix because some sounds are worth keeping. Sophie, 3 minutes to the kitchen cereal, and a question I would not have an answer to which has never once slowed her down. I walked back through the fallen leaves toward the house, the morning light coming up gray and even over the roofline, the sound of the freight yard carrying faintly from beyond the tree line where it has always been. I had all the time in the world. If there's one thing I want to say to anyone who has listened this far, this isn't just a grandpa story about money or legal documents. This is a grandpa story about what a man nearly lost because he was too busy building things to look at the people he was building them for. And if you found these grandpa stories today, I hope something in them stays with you long after this ends. I'm not a man who talks about God often, but there were nights I sat alone in that dark living room, and I understood that it was not coincidence that every piece fell into place the way it did. Something larger than me was arranging the road ahead. I just had to be quiet enough to see it. This is the lesson of this family story. Don't be like me. Don't wait until everything is nearly broken before you turn around and look at the people standing right beside you. I spent 48 years learning that a company can run without you. A family cannot. This family story taught me that the hard way, and I was lucky enough to still have time to change it. My personal opinion after everything, trust is not a weakness. But trust without attention is a vulnerability. Loving someone does not mean closing your eyes to the truth about what is happening around them. Every family story worth telling has that lesson somewhere inside it. These grandpa stories exist because someone has to say the things that are easier to leave unsaid. Walter's family story. My story is one I hope plants something useful in whoever carries it forward. Because the best grandpa stories are never really about the grandfather. They're about what gets passed down. If this reached you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very last word. That means more than I can say. A note going forward, some stories ahead contain fictional elements constructed purely for educational and inspirational purposes. If that's not the content you're looking for, that's completely fine. Choose the journey that's right for you.